Okay, let me begin with a little thank you message. First of all, let me thank the Center for American Studies for inviting me here, because I feel very happy and honored to speak to you today. And of course, let me thank you for your attendance, because I know it's getting quite late and still you are here, so what can I say? This is simply awesome. My name is Luke, and I'm a creator and author of a website related to American culture, history, and traveling. And today I would like to cover briefly a very specific topic, which is the history of Lincoln Highway. Why, you may ask? Because it was the first transcontinental coast-to-coast highway in the American history. So actually, after the real important and complex classes like constitutional law or political philosophy, this is just to entertain you a little bit. So let's begin. Okay, here's the map of the US, of course, with Lincoln Highway on it. And as you can see, it is quite a long road, right? Which connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific Ocean. And here is how it used to look in the past. So I think it's beautiful, right? And because because it was the first such road, nowadays we can say that after over 100 years of existence, it became a symbol of change, of innovation, of freedom, and also of general development of the American society. It shows very clearly how times and people and their lifestyles were changing through the decades in the US. So I would like this half an hour or maybe even 20-25 minutes to be a journey for us through the last 2 centuries of American history. Please don't consider it as a lesson or a true lecture, but just as a friendly inspirational meeting, because what I would like to achieve here is to make you feel interested in the topic and maybe inspired to travel and get to know this magnificent road by yourself. The first date I would like to point out here is 1845, when for the first time Manifest Destiny was introduced. I believe you may be familiar with what Manifest Destiny was, but for those who are not, let me just very quickly say that it was a view that American people were supposed to control all land between the east and the west coast. At the beginning, it referred mostly to the region of Oregon, but quite quickly the understanding of Manifest Destiny evaluated into something much bigger. American leaders, including President Polk, began to understand that the country had enough power and also that it was, let me say, chosen even by God to lead the whole continent, and especially all the areas between Rio Grande and the northern borders. All right, so another site with Manifest Destiny and the next one. Okay, so now here is a very simple map that I found somewhere in the internet, so please forgive me the quality of it. I know it's maybe not very accurate, but actually it shows clearly how the country grew in general. You can easily see that in the middle of 19th century, many western territories began to be controlled by the United States. Please take a closer look at the green and brown areas on the left side of the slide of the map, because these 2 territories were absolutely essential for actually any kind of further developments in the country. Thanks to them, Americans could finally admit that the whole land between the 2 oceans belonged to them. And more or less, this is when the famous westward expansion began, so in the middle of the 19th century. And also these 2 areas were the main destinations of that expansion. To be more precise, some groups, for example, explorers and traders, had been traveling across the western territories even a couple of decades before these lands attracted other Americans. But anyway, it was not very common, so please consider it only as a trivia. And the fact is that when Oregon was attached to the country, and after the gold rush in California appeared, hundreds of thousands of people decided to go west. These massive migrations began because people believed that the new territories could bring them new opportunities. In many cases, they were looking for a bit of luck in California or for free land to own and maintain in Oregon. And generally speaking, they simply hoped for a better life, for a better future, a better place to live. So we can say that this was their way of pursuing happiness, something we all know from the American Constitution. Okay, after this short introduction, now comes the most important part of my presentation, because I'll speak about traveling. So the question is, how did all these people used to travel in the middle of the 19th century? They had to cross sometimes even 3,000 miles with mountains on the way, rivers, dangerous animals, heat, rain, wind, anything could happen. So it was not easy at all, as they didn't have cars, nor any other quick and safe form of transportation. Very often they were just walking barefoot for months. Some travelers were using typical and very recognizable wagons, like these ones here that you can see, but that was it. A very dangerous and exhausting journey, a very long one too. But by the end of the century, both coasts got connected by railways, and indeed this was already a revolution. Here you can see a rail map of the United States from 1892, where both black and red lines show railway connections. And let's be honest, in my opinion, it looks quite impressive, taking into consideration the size of America and number of towns they were connecting. You can see that at least two important long lines were connecting California and Oregon with the rest of the country. But what you won't find here are roads. Why there are absolutely no roads visible here? Well, firstly, because it's a rail map, that's for sure, but also because there were absolutely no nationwide paved roads back then in America. This might sound a bit weird for Europeans, because I think we all used to learn about 2,000-year-old ancient Rome paved road systems, for example, but well, and this is the history of Europe, not the US. In America, there were no cross-country roads at the beginning of the 20th century. Of course, there were some trails between towns and villages, but they were mostly muddy and dirt farmer roads, and that's it, nothing more actually. But everything was supposed to change finally in 1912, when Carl Fisher came up with a brilliant idea that perhaps automobiles would soon become the main mode of transportation for Americans. So the country should have a good direct road connection between coast to coast, between two most important cities on both sides of the country back then. So New York City and San Francisco in California. It's worth noting that this was a very visionary idea, because back then cars were incredibly expensive, and only the richest could afford them. They could cost up to 2-year wages of a typical worker. But anyway, Fisher believed in the project and began to lobby among the automobile industry leaders to fund the construction of a new road. He wanted to designate the road very quickly, so it would be ready for the International Expo that was taking place in San Francisco in 1915, but it took a bit longer than he thought. 1 year after the International Exposition, so in 1916, Lincoln Highway was introduced to Americans for the very first time. And already then it changed America forever, because finally you could take your car and travel on your own as you liked, as you wanted to, from one coast to another, like many people do nowadays. But it is extremely important to say that in 1916 it was not a real road yet. In such a short time, within just a couple of years actually, it was impossible to create a good highway. So in many parts it was rather a designated coast-to-coast trail, not a highway. The surface of the road was just terrible in many parts, not paved, full of holes, full of mud. Sometimes travelers had to use railroad bridges to cross rivers, often without any possibility to verify train schedules, which of course wasn't the safest method of traveling. And everything was supposed to start changing after a revolutionary decision of Mr. Ford, who began producing a new, cheap, and very easy to repair model named Ford T. This is what the famous car looks like. Ford T was around 5 to even 20 times cheaper than competitive cars. So obviously, more and more people began to drive. By 1921, 5 million Ford T cars were sold. In 1924, 10 million. In 1927, 15 million. So as you can see, this was a huge and also a very rapid change, and at the same time, a significant development for the whole society. People began to travel on their own, and they actually wanted to finally get to know America, to explore it on their own, and this is how Lincoln Highway became famous among tourists and slowly started to get improved. Hotels, like this one here, and campsites began opening by Lincoln Highway, which helped the road a lot because the owners of these sites wanted to be visible. So often they were marking the road, they were putting signs so travelers could recognize where to go. Often they also helped to improve their local parts of the road, so a town and their businesses were accessible. However, even with such a local support, the general quality of Lincoln Highway didn't really improve very much. For example, a bit further from larger towns or cities, farmers often had to come with their horses to help the travelers when their cars got stuck in the middle of nowhere. Here we've got some farmers helping travelers, and here another picture of how the road used to look like back then. Here a driver crossing some river. So a fun fact is that I'm not sure if I remember it correctly, but in around 1920 or 1919, an army convoy wanted to cross the country from east to the west, and it took them 2 months to cross the country, and around 200 crashes or other incidents happened during the way. So it only shows how difficult and dangerous it was to cross America back then. And since the army had those issues, both tourists and governments, local and federal governments, realized that actually it was very important to have a good road connections between two coasts, just to drive safely and easily. In the 20s, many more important routes were designated, including the most famous one, Route 66. But they all had exactly the same quality issues. As a result, there was absolutely no way for Americans to drive across the country conveniently, nor safely. However, in the 30s, everything changed. As you may know, the American society faced a huge economical crisis called the Great Depression. And this was when President Roosevelt proposed his New Deal, a very complex project that was supposed to provide Americans with public jobs and, simply speaking, to boost the American economy. Among many great projects, such as building Hoover Dam in Nevada, or LaGuardia Airport in New York, or Bay Bridge in San Francisco, there were also many smaller local programs, and quite often they referred to improvement of local roads. And this is how all these famous highways got paved, actually, including Lincoln Highway, which became the first fully paved coast-to-coast highway in the US. It was the era of a giant economical crisis that helped the highway very much. Then the war came, the Second World War, and honestly speaking, this was another very important period for the American economy, because when Oahu here was attacked by Japanese forces, Americans understood that they needed to develop not only their army as soon as possible, but also many industries that were supposed to support the army. They also knew that roads were absolutely essential to relocate soldiers and equipment easily, which was an important issue, of course, because the size of the continent and the country was very challenging then. And this is, for example, why famous Alaska Highway was built incredibly quickly, by the way, within only 8 months, because Americans had to connect conveniently northern army bases in Alaska with the rest of the continent. The truth is, this was actually the only reason for building this road that quickly, the Second World War. But anyway, during the war, many roads were built, many other got improved, and when the war was over, the USA became an absolutely different country. It was already very well developed, with general prosperity and great perspectives for the future. And this is when the famous routes became even more popular, legendary, I would say, especially among tourists. After the war, Americans wanted to finally feel free to rest, to travel, to explore the natural wonders, to visit the national parks, lakes, waterfalls, beaches, villages, cities, and many various local attractions during their cross-country road trips. So the 40s, but especially the 50s, were the best decades for transcontinental routes such as Lincoln Highway, but also Route 66, Pacific Coast Highway, and many more. They truly changed America for the second time already. But then, in 1956, President Eisenhower, who faced another great war, which was the Cold War, understood that these roads may not be enough in case of a nuclear attack, for example. He was afraid that in case of a massive Soviet attack, people should have been able to escape effectively. And what's more, everyone knew that more and more Americans owned cars, and someday the old roads wouldn't have had enough capacity for them. So the president introduced his National System of Interstate and Defense Highways, or simply speaking, just interstate highway system. The idea was to build wide freeways and allow Americans to travel between cities across the country fast and safe. Of course, finalizing such a huge project took time, and the construction of the original system wasn't proclaimed complete until 1992. However, already during the 60s, many old roads and many towns along them were already bypassed and, as a result, abandoned. Just to give you an example, there's a small town in Wyoming, Medicine Bow. This is a picture of it. In Medicine Bow, there were 57 small businesses during Lincoln Highway's peak of popularity. And of course, most of these 57 businesses were linked with traveling-related industries. There were gas stations, tire sellers, restaurants, bars, motels, campsite equipment stores, and many more. But since 1970, when a new freeway, I-80, was opened nearby, it now has only 4 such businesses. So it used to have 57, and now it has only 4. This proves how heavily the new interstate system demolished the old roads, towns, and whole societies that used to live mainly from tourism there. This issue was shown perfectly in the movie Cars, which I honestly recommend to watch. I know it's just a cartoon, but it presents that era and its atmosphere perfectly, in my opinion. It's more about Route 66, but that was bypassed by Interstate 40, but actually the issue was very similar there, and in case of many other routes as well, including Lincoln Highway, of course. All right, I will slowly begin to finish my speech, and now let me just say that nowadays you can travel along the original Lincoln Highway. There is a Lincoln Highway Association that takes care of the road and that keeps promoting the idea of traveling along it. So if you decide to travel across the United States that way, you will have to avoid freeways, of course, and follow the map that is available on the Lincoln Highway Association website. If you're interested, just take a picture of the slide and definitely visit this website when you decide to travel, because it's incredibly informative. You will find here points of interest, historical facts, driving suggestions, and it's also incredibly well prepared, because the authors decided to use different colors and show how the road used to change in some parts. Of course, you can zoom everything and see all these amazing details, addresses, descriptions, sometimes photos. So I truly encourage you to visit. And I also recommend to watch a great movie by PBS named 100 Years on the Lincoln Highway from 2014. You can find it on YouTube and watch it there for free. It's really wonderful. And of course, if you want to feel the vibe of hitting the road in America and see wonderful, calm landscapes, definitely check some great famous movies like Easy Rider or This Must Be the Place, Vanishing Point, and many, many others. Here are just a couple of my recommendations. So of course, take a picture of them as well if you wish. And if only you speak Polish, I encourage you to visit my website where I made an article about 10 famous American routes, including, of course, Lincoln Highway, which I think is the most important highway in the American history. If you don't speak Polish, just let me know, I don't know, write maybe an email so I can translate it to you if only you wish, no problem at all. And okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. Again, it was an honest pleasure for me to be here with you. I hope you find this very short meeting interesting. I also wish it inspired you to learn more about the history of American roads and the reasons for creating them, because nowadays they represent the past, the history. And of course, I hope this meeting inspired you to travel across the US and get to know Lincoln Highway on your own. If you'd like to contact me or perhaps ask some questions, feel free to do so here or by sending me an email. Here I present my email address, so go ahead. I will be more than happy to reply and to try to answer your questions or support in planning your journey. All right, thank you very much. 20 minutes. Okay. It's not an easy question, of course, but I would say you definitely need at least 2 weeks. It depends on how you travel. In the article I mentioned, I wrote that 2 weeks is a minimum, definitely, but of course you can spend there a month and keep busy all the time because there's so much to see. But 2 weeks at least, I would say, yes. Oh yeah, right. I don't think there are such companies. Unfortunately, maybe there are, but I'm not aware of them. For sure, yes, it is costly. You have to rent a car in New York and drive 2 weeks to San Francisco, and there are also some drop-off charges that rental companies want you to pay. So it's not very easy. Definitely, but what we always, because I plan travel trips in the US with my wife, so when we look for some good deals, we always just keep looking all the time, day after day, and compare different car rentals and compare the prices. Sometimes sign up for their newsletters because they send some deals. We also try to contact them by phone or email, so just try as many different ways as possible to get better prices, because I don't think there are such companies as you mentioned, unfortunately. Not yet. Yes. Yes, actually, they were incredibly important because you had many big, large, well-prospering cities in the East, right? In, let's say, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, many cities, Detroit, etc. But also you had a lot of new towns and then cities in the west, so Los Angeles, San Francisco. They were not as well developed at the beginning as eastern cities like New York, but they were developing incredibly quickly due to internal domestic migrations and their new industries that were being allocated there. So the roads connected everything and made it possible to develop other towns and cities along the way, between West and between the East. So yes, I would say that they were incredibly important.